5 words on a screen. We're not coming. Don't call. No signature needed. After 33 years, I knew that clipped surgical precision anywhere. My father had delivered his final order, and this time there would be no appeal. The uniform hanging beside me caught the morning light, ribbons gleaming like small victories he'd never witnessed. I wasn't begging anymore. I was done kneeling for approval that would never come. But the ache, that hollow space where a parent's love should live, still throbbed like a wound that refuses to close. My name is Kira Brennan, and I got married in uniform. Not because tradition demanded it, but because I refused to hide the woman I'd fought to become. The morning began in silence, the kind that settles over a naval base before dawn, heavy with purpose and unspoken prayers. My dress whites hung pressed and ready, each crease sharp enough to cut through doubt. The ribbons on my chest told stories my father never stayed long enough to hear. My heart beat in that steady Navy rhythm I'd learned years ago. The calm before command, the breath before the dive. Then my phone buzzed against the nightstand. One message. 5 words that would strip away any lingering hope I'd been foolish enough to carry. We're not coming. Don't call. Have fun. No explanation. No regret. Just orders. Delivered the only way Colonel Robert Brennan knew how to communicate with cold efficiency and zero room for negotiation. I stared at those words until they blurred. My reflection blinked back from the darkened screen, navy blue eyes, my mother's eyes, and the faint outline of a ribbon beside my shoulder. The ache wasn't new. It was an old companion familiar as my own heartbeat. But I didn't cry. Tears don't change a commanding officer's mind. And my father had made it clear long ago that emotions were weaknesses to be eliminated, not expressed. I simply turned, handed the phone to my fiancé, Ethan Cole, and said quietly, he finally answered. Ethan was a federal agent, steady as winter tide, calm in the kind of chaos that breaks most people. He glanced at the message once. No shock registered on his face, no judgment, just the kind of understanding that comes from knowing someone's scars without needing to see them. Then, without a word, he made 3 quick calls. His voice stayed even, professional. The tone of a man who solves problems for a living. A few short exchanges. A couple of quiet confirmations. Then he looked at me, offered that half smile I'd fallen for in a Washington briefing room 2 years ago, and said, "It's handled. Let's begin." I didn't ask what he meant. In our world, handled meant safe, protected, done. The questions could wait. Right now, I had a choice to make. Let his absence define this day or walk forward anyway. I chose to walk. The chapel waited just a few blocks away on base, small, white, simple. Its bell tower rose against the Atlantic sky like a lighthouse guiding lost sailors home. Outside, early spring sunlight spilled over the cobblestones, warm and forgiving, as if the world itself wanted to offer what my father wouldn't. I walked there alone. My heels struck the ground in measured rhythm, each step a declaration. With every footfall, I reminded myself that this life, this uniform, these scars and victories were mine. I'd built them from silence and stubbornness, from every "you can't" I'd turned into "watch me." This wasn't about proving anything to him anymore. It was about honoring what I'd become in spite of him. When I reached the chapel doors, 2 men stood waiting. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Hill and Senior Chief Diego Torres, both from my old SEAL support unit. They wore dress whites, crisp and proud, medals catching the light. Hill gave a sharp nod, his voice rough with something I recognized as loyalty. "You didn't think we'd let you walk in alone, Mom?" I felt something soft rise in my chest, breaking through years of armor I'd carefully constructed. "You 2 are supposed to be guests," I said, my voice not quite steady. Torres grinned, the same grin I'd seen after a successful mission when adrenaline faded and relief took its place. "And you're supposed to be someone who lets people stand with her." "Let us do that." I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. "Then let's make it sharp." They flanked me as I entered. Inside, a few dozen guests rose to their feet. Civilians, officers, enlisted sailors I'd trained with years ago. Every face carried warmth I hadn't expected, hadn't believed I deserved. The air smelled faintly of salt and polished wood, of history and hope mixed together. The organ began, simple and solemn, each note settling into my bones. As I walked down that aisle, I wasn't thinking about flowers or cake or any of the things most brides spend months planning. I thought about the first time my father told me I wasn't cut out for the Navy. I was 12 years old, sitting at the kitchen table while he shined his boots to a mirror finish. Leave the uniform to men who can handle it, he'd said, not even looking up, as if my dreams weren't worth the effort of eye contact. I had spent 2 decades proving I could handle it, proving it to everyone except the one person whose opinion I'd been taught to value above my own. Now, as I moved toward Ethan waiting near the altar, the sun broke through the stained glass, scattering light across my shoulder boards. Gold trim flashed like small fires, proof of a life lived on the edge of purpose, on the razor's edge between duty and identity. The chaplain began the ceremony, his voice steady and practiced. "Do you, Kira Brennan, take this man?" I barely heard him. My mind drifted for just a second to the phone tucked away in my bag, to that message still glowing cold in its grey bubble. "Don't call." My father's absence wasn't new. He'd missed my high school graduation because of a training exercise. He'd missed my commissioning ceremony because he was busy. He'd missed my mother's funeral because even in grief, he couldn't let himself be vulnerable enough to need his daughter. But somehow this felt final. Not angry, just empty. Like a flagpole without a flag, standing alone against the wind. Ethan squeezed my hands, his touch grounding me, pulling me back from the edge of old wounds. "You're here," he whispered, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "And that's enough." We exchanged vows, simple, unadorned. No grand promises copied from the internet. No poetry we didn't mean. Just truth spoken clearly. "I promise to protect what we build," I said. "I promise to honor what you've already built," he replied. When the chaplain pronounced us husband and wife, the small crowd erupted in applause, brief but heartfelt, echoing off the chapel's high ceiling. Outside, sunlight poured over the base like liquid gold, blessing everything it touched. My SEAL teammates had formed an arch of sabers without being asked, blades glinting as we stepped beneath them. A photographer caught the moment. I smiled, not the kind that hides pain, but the kind that finally lets go of it. That night, while guests laughed over toasts and stories about missions they couldn't fully describe, I found a quiet corner by the window. The ocean was calm, its rhythm slow and familiar, the same rhythm I'd learned to breathe by. I checked my phone, hating myself a little for still hoping. Nothing. No apology, no congratulations, not even a second thought from the man who'd once taught me that discipline mattered more than love. I placed the phone face down on the table and joined Ethan outside. We stood together beneath the stars, the sound of waves filling the silence between us, speaking the language we'd both learned in service, the language of presence without words. "You okay?" he asked. "Yeah," I said and meant it. He made his choice and I made mine. Ethan nodded, slipped an arm around my waist. "Then that's that." But as the night went on, I couldn't shake the image of my father's face. Jaw set, arms crossed, eyes hard as gravel. He'd always believed I was too stubborn, too emotional, too much like my mother. Maybe he was right about one thing. I never quit. Not when he told me I couldn't. Not when the odds said I shouldn't. Not even when his silence became a wall I could never climb. When we finally left the reception, the last of the candles burned low, their flames steady despite the coastal wind. I looked back once at the chapel, the same place I'd been commissioned as an officer a decade ago. It felt fitting somehow, a circle closing and opening at the same time. As the car pulled away, I whispered to myself, not in defeat but in release. "You didn't come, but I don't need you to understand anymore." I grew up in a house where silence was louder than words, more cutting than any reprimand. My father, Colonel Robert Brennan, believed emotion was weakness and affection was something earned like rank through performance, never given freely as birthright. He woke at 5 a.m. sharp every morning, polished his boots until you could see your soul reflected back, and expected everyone else in the house to operate with the same rigid precision. Even breakfast had rules. No elbows on the table. Speak when spoken to. Never, ever question orders. Our home wasn't a household. It was a command post disguised as a family, and we were all soldiers who'd never enlisted. Mom was the only warmth in it, Eleanor Brennan, a literature teacher who quoted Emily Dickinson while folding laundry and saw beauty in ordinary moments my father dismissed as weakness. She used to whisper things like, "Bravery isn't always loud, Kira. Sometimes it's quiet and stubborn, like roots growing through stone." I didn't understand what she meant until years later, until I'd been knocked down enough times to learn that getting back up was its own kind of courage. She was the calm after his storms, the softness that kept the walls from closing in completely. Without her, I don't think I would have survived childhood intact. My earliest memories of my father are of him leaving, duffel bags slung over his shoulder, eyes forward, no hugs, no waves. Just a man marching toward his next mission as if we were obstacles he had to navigate around. He'd tell me, "Duty first, kid. Everything else second." I used to wait by the window for his car to return, counting the hours until he came home, believing that maybe this time, he'd see me. When he finally walked through the door, I'd run to him, arms outstretched, desperate for the kind of fatherly affection I'd seen other kids receive so easily. But he'd sidestep with a firm "at ease," as if I were a recruit out of line instead of his daughter. I learned early that wanting approval from him was like chasing horizon lines. You could run forever and never get closer. By the time I was 10, I'd memorized every rank insignia in the army. I'd help him press his uniforms, line up his medals in precise order, shine his belt buckle until it gleamed. It was our unspoken truce, service as connection, labor as love. I thought if I could just be good enough, disciplined enough, perfect enough, he'd finally look at me the way fathers in movies looked at their daughters, with pride that needed no conditions. Until one day, while watching the Army-Navy game on TV, he said something that carved itself into my bones. Words that would echo through every decision I'd make for the next 2 decades. "You'll never wear those colors, kid," he muttered, eyes glued to the screen. "Leave the uniform to men who can handle it." He didn't look at me when he said it. He didn't have to. The dismissal was complete, final. I remember the exact taste of that silence afterward. Metallic like blood from biting your own tongue. I didn't cry. Crying would have proven him right. I just memorized the scoreboard and the name Annapolis, letting both burn into memory like a brand I'd carry forever. From that moment, I studied harder, ran faster, pushed myself beyond what anyone expected. If the military was built on endurance, I decided to outlast his doubt. Every morning, I'd wake before him, run until my lungs burned, do push-ups until my arms shook. I'd ace every test, win every race, exceed every standard. Not because I loved the challenge, but because I was desperate to prove I was worthy of wearing those colors he'd denied me. Mom saw what I was doing, the slow destruction of chasing approval that would never come. But she never interfered directly. She'd just smile softly and slip notes into my lunchbox that read, "Storms build sailors, my love. Let the wind make you strong." I kept every single note even when I stopped believing them. When I turned 17, I applied to the US Naval Academy. I didn't tell him until the acceptance letter arrived, thick and official and proof that someone somewhere believed I could handle it. I left it on the kitchen table beside his coffee mug, my heart pounding as I waited for his reaction. He didn't even touch it. He just stared for a full 30 seconds, his jaw working like he was chewing through words he'd never say. Then finally, "So you're serious about this nonsense?" "Yes, sir," I answered, because that's what he demanded I call him. Sir, not Dad. Never Dad. "Yes, sir. I'm serious." He didn't speak to me for 2 months. The silence in that house was suffocating, oppressive, a constant reminder that I'd committed the unforgivable sin of choosing my own path instead of accepting his verdict on my life. The night before I left for Annapolis, he dropped a manila folder on my bed. Inside were brochures for law schools, nursing programs, even a teaching college. Not one with an anchor or an eagle on the cover. It was his silent protest wrapped in glossy paper. His last attempt to redirect me towards something more appropriate for a daughter. Mom hugged me that morning at the bus stop, tears hidden behind sunglasses she didn't need on a cloudy day. "Make your own colors, Kira," she whispered. "Wear them proud." He stayed inside. The curtains didn't even move. No goodbye, no good luck. Just absence, which somehow hurt worse than any words could have. That was the day I learned that love, in his world, was conditional on obedience, and I had just failed the only test that mattered to him. At Annapolis, I carried that weight like a rucksack I couldn't put down, heavy and constant, digging into my shoulders with every step. Being a woman in uniform meant walking twice as far for half the credit, meant proving yourself every single day while men with half your skill got promoted on potential. I wasn't the strongest or the loudest, but I was relentless. I refused to quit because quitting would mean he was right. Every morning before drills, I'd press my uniform until the creases could cut glass, as if perfection could armor me against doubt, against the voice in my head that sounded exactly like my father saying, "You'll never handle it." The first year was brutal. I failed my navigation test twice. tore a ligament during endurance training, and nearly washed out during Hell Week. Every night when the others slept, I'd sit by the window in the dorm, looking toward the bay and whisper to myself, "You'll see, Dad. One day you'll have to salute me." It wasn't healthy. I know that now. But back then, it was the only thing keeping me going. Letters came from Mom, small envelopes with messy handwriting and pressed flowers tucked inside. She'd send snippets of poems, encouragements that felt like lifelines. "My Stormbird," she called me in every letter. "Keep flying." My father never wrote once, not even a "stay safe." Just silence stretching across the miles between us like a chasm I couldn't bridge no matter how many achievements I mailed home. When Mom died during my 3rd year at the academy, breast cancer that moved fast and merciless, I wasn't granted enough leave to say goodbye. The message came through my commanding officer, sterile and efficient. "Family emergency," it read, as if death were just another logistical problem to solve. By the time I got home, she was already gone. My father stood by her casket in full dress uniform, eyes fixed straight ahead, jaw set like stone. I waited for him to speak, to acknowledge my presence, to show even a flicker of the grief we should have shared. He didn't. Not at the service, not afterward, not when I whispered, voice breaking, "She would have wanted you to be proud of me." He just walked away, leaving me standing alone beside her grave. After that, the silence between us hardened into something permanent. A wall built brick by brick from all the things we'd never say. Even when I graduated top of my class. Even when I received honors for leadership, he didn't attend. A mutual friend later told me he'd bragged about it quietly to a few old army buddies. Proof that somewhere deep down he felt something. But he couldn't say it to me. Couldn't look me in the eye and admit he'd been wrong. I kept chasing his shadow, though. Every promotion, every commendation. I mailed home a photo, desperate for any response. When I pinned on Lieutenant Commander at 29, I sent him a framed picture with a short note, "Still serving, sir. Thought you should know." He returned it 2 weeks later, unopened. The envelope was marked "refused" in his block handwriting, each letter precise and cold. That night, I stood by the barracks sink and burned every letter I'd ever written him, watching the paper curl and blacken. The smoke smelled faintly of ink and old hope, of a daughter who'd finally realized she was begging for crumbs from a man who'd never learned how to share a meal. Then I took out my uniform, pressed it again with hands that shook, and whispered the same words Mom had once told me. "Storms build sailors, and I'm still standing." When people ask why I joined the Navy, I don't talk about patriotism or paychecks or serving my country. I talk about silence, how it can break a person or build one, depending on what you do with it. My father taught me duty. My mother taught me meaning. Between them, I found my own kind of command, one that didn't require anyone's approval but my own. Still, even after all those years, part of me wanted just one thing for him to look at me, even once, and say, "Well done, Kira." He never did. But that didn't stop me from earning it anyway, from becoming the officer he said I'd never be. I learned early that strength isn't about shouting the loudest or demanding respect through fear. It's about standing firm when the wind changes, about leading with your actions instead of your rank. The Navy taught me that. Or maybe I taught it to myself through every rejection that came before, every door that slammed in my face, every man who assumed I didn't belong. When I first arrived at my duty station in Norfolk, I was 23 and raw. More conviction than confidence, more willpower than experience. My first assignment was logistical coordination for coastal operations, a job most officers dismissed as glorified paperwork. But logistics is what keeps missions alive. Fuel, transport, medical routes, supply chains. Without it, even the toughest SEALs can't move an inch. The first time I briefed my commanding officer, he didn't look up from his coffee. "Lieutenant Brennan," he said flatly, stirring in sugar with deliberate slowness. "You've got 2 strikes already. Young and female. Don't make a third." So I didn't. I made sure every supply run landed early. Every report was flawless, every operation accounted for down to the last bolt. When others were out at bars blowing off steam, I was reviewing convoy routes and updating weather charts. Triple-checking everything because one mistake would confirm every doubt they had about women in uniform. I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because failure would have proven him right, would have proven my father right, would have proven every skeptic who'd ever looked at me and seen weakness instead of potential. 3 years in, I was assigned to assist a rescue unit during hurricane season. Our mission was simple on paper: secure critical supply lines before landfall, ensure civilian evacuations ran smoothly. Reality, of course, had other plans. The storm hit harder than predicted, Category 4 winds that turned roads into rivers and communications into static. Roads washed out, communications went down, civilians were trapped. I volunteered to lead a small team through a flooded highway to retrieve a family stranded in a half-submerged sedan, waters rising by the minute. I still remember the taste of that salt water, metallic and bitter like adrenaline mixed with fear. Rain slashed sideways, visibility down to nothing. My team yelled through radios that barely worked, voices crackling with static and panic. When we reached the vehicle, a child was crying inside, no more than 6 years old, pressed against the back window with terror in his eyes. I waded through chest-high water, currents pulling at my legs, pushed the door open against the pressure and carried him out on my shoulders while his mother sobbed in disbelief, clutching her infant daughter. We got them to higher ground, shivering and exhausted but alive. No medals, no photos, no headlines. Just a handshake from a soaked police officer who said, voice rough with emotion, "Didn't think Navy folks still did this kind of thing." I smiled, water dripping from my uniform. "We do what needs doing, sir." That storm earned me my first commendation and a new nickname, Iceback. Some said it was because I stayed calm under pressure, made decisions with a clear head when everyone else was panicking. Others said it was because I didn't flinch when pain came, didn't complain, didn't ask for special treatment. Both were true. I'd learned long ago that showing emotion was a luxury I couldn't afford. After that mission, things changed. Command started listening when I spoke. Doors that had been closed began to crack open. I was offered a position overseeing SEAL logistics coordination, a first for someone my age and gender. It meant working side by side with the men I'd once supplied from a distance, learning the rhythm of their world, the unspoken codes and fierce loyalty that held them together. I worked with the SEALs for years, watching how they moved, spoke, trusted each other with the kind of bond built in gunfire and salt spray. They tested me, of course, with subtle jabs and jokes that walked the line between hazing and assessment. One evening, after a particularly long briefing, one of them said, "Ma'am, no offense, but what do you know about combat?" I looked him straight in the eye, held his gaze until the room went quiet. "Enough to make sure you get home to your family." "That's what I know." He never questioned me again. Neither did the others. I started training with them before dawn, push-ups in the sand, timed runs along the beach, cold water dives that left my skin numb and my lungs burning. I wasn't required to, but I couldn't ask for their respect from behind a desk, couldn't lead people I didn't understand. Eventually the teasing stopped. They began calling me Skipper, a title they gave only when earned, only when you'd proven yourself not just capable, but worthy of their trust. Years passed in a blur of deployments. Bahrain, Okinawa, the South Pacific, each port carrying its own lessons. Respect is never given freely. It's earned quietly through consistency and competence, through showing up when it's hard and staying when it's harder. I built my reputation on results, not rhetoric. When someone needed a problem solved, they called me. When a mission went sideways, they knew I'd have a contingency plan. But success is a lonely kind of promotion. For every bar I pinned to my shoulder, another layer of distance grew between me and my father. He'd stopped answering my calls by then, stopped acknowledging my existence entirely. But I still left voicemails after each milestone, my voice steady even when my hands shook. "Hey, Dad, made commander today." Or, "We completed an operation with 0 casualties. Thought you'd want to know." The silence that followed was heavier than any body armor I'd ever worn. One day, after a long training rotation, I came home to find a package at my door. No return address, just my name in his unmistakable block handwriting. My heart jumped despite myself, despite years of learning not to hope. Inside was a newspaper clipping, yellowed at the edges. Navy officer commended for heroic action during flood rescue. Folded beneath it, a single line written in his precise script. "You did your job." Nothing more. It wasn't praise. It was acknowledgement stripped of warmth, recognition without emotion. But for some reason, some stubborn, foolish reason, I taped it to my mirror and looked at it every morning before leaving for work. Not as motivation. More as a reminder that some people will only ever see half of who you are, and that has to be enough because it's all they're capable of giving. Still, I kept climbing. I took command of my own SEAL support unit at 31, the youngest woman to hold that position. Under my leadership, efficiency improved and accident rates dropped. My methods were unconventional: mandatory mental health check-ins, family liaison programs, peer debriefs after difficult missions. The old brass called it soft leadership, said I was coddling the troops. The men under me called it humanity, and their retention rates spoke louder than any criticism. The first time one of my sailors thanked me for saving his marriage, tears in his eyes, I realized I'd done something my father never could. I led with empathy, not fear. I saw my people as human beings, not just tools to accomplish a mission. One evening, after a long day of field exercises, I sat on the pier watching the sun dip below the waterline. The waves lapped against the wood like breathing, rhythmic and eternal. I thought about my father's life, all rules and no reflection, all discipline and no connection. And I wondered if maybe he'd built his own prison out of pride, locked himself in a cell of his own making. I pulled out my phone and drafted a message I never sent. I don't need your approval anymore, Dad, but I wish you knew the woman you built. The one who learned to be strong because you refused to let her be soft. I deleted it before hitting send. Some messages are meant to be carried, not delivered. That night, as I lay awake listening to the hum of the base generators, I realized something that changed everything. The uniform I wore wasn't just armor or obligation or proof. It was inheritance. Not from my father, but from every person I'd served beside. Every sailor who'd called me Mom with genuine respect. Every mission we'd completed together. Steel isn't born, it's forged. And salt water doesn't just sting. It cleans the wound, strips away what's unnecessary, leaves only what's strong enough to survive. I closed my eyes and let the sound of the sea remind me that storms, no matter how violent, eventually pass. And when they do, what remains isn't what was broken. It's what refused to break. Ethan Cole didn't walk into my life like a storm. He arrived like a steady current, quiet and constant, the kind of presence that changes things without demanding attention. We met at a joint Navy FBI cybersecurity briefing in Washington, one of those interagency meetings that usually accomplish nothing except wasting everyone's time. I was there to represent Naval Logistics Command. He was the liaison from the Bureau's counterintelligence division. I'd expected another paper pusher in a suit, another bureaucrat more concerned with procedure than results. What I got was a man who looked at me like I wasn't supposed to prove myself first, like my presence was assumed competence instead of questioned capability. The first words he ever said to me were, "Your report formatting is terrible." I stared at him, unamused, my jaw tightening. "Your chain of command is out of order," I shot back, pointing to a glaring error in his section. That was how it started. A clash between precision and practicality, between military protocol and federal flexibility. But by the end of that week, we'd rewritten half the tasking procedures together, found a middle ground that actually made sense. He worked quietly without ego and listened when others didn't. In a room full of authority figures competing to be the loudest voice, his patience was its own form of command. He started leaving small things on my desk after particularly long meetings. Not flowers or notes, nothing romantic or presumptuous, just coffee. Always black, always hot, always exactly when I needed it most. One morning I finally asked, "Is this a bribe?" He smiled, that half smile that would eventually undo me. "A peace offering. You seem like someone who runs on caffeine and silence." He wasn't wrong. Months passed, and those quiet coffees turned into long evening conversations about work ethics, about the strange burden of wearing purpose like armor, about what it costs to care deeply in professions that demand emotional distance. He wasn't military, but he understood order, understood the weight of responsibility that sits on your shoulders at 3 a.m. when you can't sleep, because someone's life might depend on a decision you made. When he finally asked me out, it wasn't some grand speech or elaborate plan, just a single line at the end of a briefing, casual as if he'd been building up to it for months. "You've saved every operation you've touched, Commander. How about saving one dinner from being lonely?" I said yes before I could talk myself out of it, before the voice in my head that sounded like my father could tell me that dating complicated things, that emotions were weaknesses, that I should focus on my career instead of my heart. Our first date wasn't candlelight or violins. It was a late-night diner just off base, fluorescent lights flickering overhead. Two people too tired to pretend to be anything other than exactly who they were. He told me about his parents, school teachers from Ohio, who'd taught him to measure success not by rank or salary but by integrity and kindness. I told him about my father, how I'd spent half my life trying to earn a nod that never came, how approval had become my addiction and my poison. He didn't pity me, didn't offer empty platitudes or try to fix what couldn't be fixed. He just said, voice quiet and certain, "Sounds like he raised someone stronger than he knew how to handle. That's his loss, not yours." That line stayed with me, burrowed into my chest and lived there. Ethan was different from anyone I'd known. He didn't try to compete with me, didn't flinch when I got called away at 2 a.m. for emergency coordination, didn't make me choose between my career and our relationship. He understood that my uniform wasn't just fabric or obligation. It was identity woven into every part of who I'd become. And he loved me for it. All of it. Even the parts that were still healing. Once, after a particularly long week of briefings and missions and sleepless nights, he said something I'll never forget. "Most people fall in love with parts of someone, Kira. I love all of you. The officer and the woman. The strength and the scars. The sailor and the storm." By the time he proposed, it felt inevitable, not dramatic. No flash mob, no public spectacle, no pressure. Just the two of us on a pier in Norfolk at sunset, boots dangling over the edge, watching the sun paint the water gold. He held a small box, simple gold band inside, and said with absolute certainty, "Let me serve beside you wherever that means, whatever that looks like." I didn't cry. I just said yes, knowing that for the first time in my life, someone saw all of me and stayed anyway. The wedding planning was minimal. Neither of us wanted spectacle or performance. A quiet ceremony at the Naval Chapel, a handful of guests who actually mattered, and the Atlantic wind as witness. I told him I'd wear my full dress whites, the uniform I'd earned through blood and salt and silence. He didn't hesitate, didn't suggest I wear a traditional gown for the photos or to make things more normal. "It's the most honest thing you own," he said simply. "Why would I want you in anything else?" Still, deep down, deeper than I wanted to admit, I hoped my father might come. Hope, after all, is stubborn. It survives long after logic says to let go. I mailed him a card 2 weeks before the wedding. Simple white cardstock with black ink. Saturday, 1300 hours. Naval Chapel. "You're welcome to attend. I'll be in uniform." No RSVP came. No call. No text. Just silence, the same silence I'd been receiving for years. The same silence I kept hoping would break. The night before the ceremony, Ethan and I agreed to sleep separately, keeping with tradition even though neither of us was particularly traditional. He stayed at a friend's apartment downtown. I stayed in the guest quarters on base, alone with my thoughts and my uniform and the hope I couldn't quite kill. I spent the evening pressing my dress whites, each movement deliberate and meditative. There's a reverence that comes with wearing what you've earned through sacrifice. Every medal, every ribbon, every seam holds a story. A moment of pain or pride or both. As I polished the brass buttons until they gleamed, my mind wandered to my father's old advice, delivered when I was still young enough to believe he meant well. "Presentation is everything, Kira. How you appear is how you'll be treated." Funny how the same words can wound and strengthen depending on who's listening and what they choose to do with them. At midnight, I hung the jacket carefully over the chair and stood by the window, watching the harbour lights shimmer on dark water. The base was quiet except for the faint hum of patrol boats cutting through the night. Somewhere out there, men and women I'd trained were on duty, steadfast and unseen, doing the work that keeps the world spinning. I thought of Mom. If she were alive, she'd have quoted something poetic. Maybe Dickinson again, her favourite poet. "The soul selects her own society, then shuts the door." She would have smiled at my uniform, touched the ribbons with gentle fingers and said I looked like light wrapped in discipline. I fell asleep just before dawn. When I woke, the world felt still, suspended in that moment right before everything changes forever. I brewed coffee, slipped into my uniform piece by piece and checked the mirror. The reflection staring back at me wasn't a bride or an officer. It was both. 2 lives, 1 truth, finally integrated after years of trying to separate duty from identity. That's when the phone buzzed. 1 new message. 5 words that would strip away any remaining hope. "We're not coming. Don't call. Have fun." I read it twice, my heart sinking even though I'd known deep down that this was coming. No punctuation missing, no hesitation. Just cold precision, the voice of the man who'd taught me control and never realized he was teaching me to survive without him. I didn't reply. What would I say? I simply picked up my cover, placed it under my arm and whispered to the empty room. Understood, sir. Then I walked toward the chapel, toward the life I'd chosen, toward the man who'd chosen me back. The drive was short, but every turn felt heavy with memory. The base gates where I'd first reported for duty. The flagpole where I'd stood for morning colours countless times. The echo of marching cadences still seemed to hang in the air. As I passed the parade grounds, I remembered my first inspection there years ago. Trembling under a commander's stare, terrified of making a mistake. Now those same grounds would lead me into marriage, into a future my father had no part in. Outside the chapel, the breeze lifted the edge of my skirt. The sky was cloudless, a sharp blue that only spring mornings near the coast can create, so clear it almost hurt to look at. I caught my breath, steadied myself against the weight of what was happening. He wouldn't be there. I knew that now with absolute certainty. But maybe, just maybe, one day he'd understand that wearing this uniform wasn't rebellion or spite or a daughter's revenge. It was legacy redefined, not rejected. It was me choosing my own colours and wearing them proud. Inside, the organ began to play and I walked toward my future. The chapel was small, framed in whitewashed brick, the kind of place built more for reverence than grandeur. When I arrived, the parking lot was nearly full, which surprised me. We hadn't invited many people. I thought maybe some of the SEALs from my old command had come to stand outside the way soldiers sometimes do, silent and respectful, paying tribute without asking for acknowledgement. Inside, the air smelled faintly of salt and varnished wood, of history preserved in polished pews and stained glass. Sunlight streamed through windows depicting ships on calm seas, beams of colour pooling on the floor like blessings. A chaplain I'd served with years ago stood by the altar, his posture ramrod straight, a quiet smile on his weathered face that said he understood what this day meant. The pews filled slowly. A few friends from the bureau sat on one side, colleagues from the Navy on the other. I felt eyes follow me as I walked to the vestry. Maybe looking for the traditional gown I wasn't wearing, the veil and flowers and all the things brides are supposed to have. Instead, I wore the truth. Full dress whites, ribbons polished, sword at my side. The gold braid shimmered under the light, not as ornament, but as testament to every battle I'd fought to stand here. The text message from my father still sat on my phone, unread beyond those first 5 brutal words. We're not coming. Don't call. Have fun. Cold, efficient, just like him. The ache was there, would probably always be there, but it didn't control me anymore. Ma'am, a voice called softly behind me. It was Chief Petty Officer Marcus Hill, one of the men I'd led years ago during a rough operation in the Gulf when everything that could go wrong did, and somehow we all made it home. He stood beside another sailor, Senior Chief Diego Torres, who'd lost part of his leg to an IED, but walked with more pride than most men with 2. Hill said, voice rough with emotion he was trying to hide. We thought we'd escort you in, if that's all right, ma'am. I felt my throat tighten, words catching. You 2 are supposed to be guests. Torres grinned, that wide, unbreakable grin I'd seen after the worst missions when we were all still alive, and that was enough. And you're supposed to be someone who lets people stand with her. Let us do that, Skipper. I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. Then let's make it sharp. The organ shifted to the procession. When the chapel doors opened, sunlight spilled in, painting gold halos across the pews, illuminating every face turned toward me. Hill and Torres flanked me, heels aligned, faces forward. The hum of conversation fell into perfect silence, that heavy silence that precedes something significant. Then, from the back of the room, a voice rang out, firm and clear and unmistakable, Admiral on deck. Every person in that chapel rose in unison, a wave of respect and recognition that hit me like a physical force. The sound of polished shoes striking wood followed, 100 hearts moving as one. I hadn't expected it. For a moment my chest tightened so hard I thought I might break. But I didn't. I simply breathed, stepped forward, and let the sound wash over me like a tide I'd spent my life swimming toward. I caught Ethan's eyes at the altar. He wasn't smiling. He just stood straight, hands clasped behind his back. His gaze steady with a pride that said more than any words could. It said, I see you. I know you. I choose you. Each step down that aisle felt deliberate, weighted with meaning I couldn't fully articulate. I wasn't walking toward a man, though Ethan stood waiting. I was walking through every storm I'd survived to get there. The years of silence, of doubt, of proving myself over and over to people who never believed women belonged in uniform. All of it converged in this moment, every sacrifice and scar and small victory leading me here. When I reached the front, Hill and Torres stopped, rendered sharp salutes and stepped aside. The chaplain opened his Bible but didn't begin right away, as if understanding that the silence itself felt holy, sacred in a way that words might diminish. Ethan stepped forward, his voice low but clear enough that only I could hear. "You look like victory." I smiled softly, feeling something break open inside me, something that had been locked away for years. "You look like peace." We didn't exchange vows written by poets or downloaded from wedding websites. We spoke from muscle memory, the kind built by years of duty and discipline and choosing each other every day. "I promise to protect what we build," I said, my voice steady. "I promise to honor what you've already built," he replied. The chaplain cleared his throat gently, his voice warm. "By the power vested in me by God and country, I now pronounce you husband and wife." No one clapped immediately. For a few seconds, the chapel stayed still, like everyone collectively understood this wasn't just a wedding. It was a reckoning, a woman claiming her place in a world that had tried to deny her, surrounded by people who finally saw her as she truly was. Then, as we turned, the applause came, deep and resonant, rising like surf against rock. Outside, the SEALs who'd gathered uninvited had formed an arch of sabers, blades gleaming in sunlight. It's a tradition usually reserved for officers marrying within the ranks, a sign of respect and brotherhood. But this time, enlisted men held the swords, men I'd led and served beside, men who'd chosen to honor me not because they had to, but because they wanted to. As Ethan and I walked beneath the arch, a single drop of seawater from one of the sabers landed on my sleeve, glistening like a tear that didn't belong to me but somehow felt earned. I looked at the horizon where ocean met sky and thought of my father. Not with anger, but with the strange calm of acceptance. He hadn't come. He'd made that choice and I couldn't change it. But in his place stood men who understood what he never did. Leadership isn't about command or control. It's about care. It's about seeing people as human beings, not tools. It's about building something together instead of demanding obedience. The reception was small, tables under a canvas tent on the base lawn, string lights swaying in the coastal breeze. Someone had hung an old Navy flag at the entrance, its edges frayed but proud, a symbol of service that transcends individual careers. Laughter carried across the air, genuine and warm. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to enjoy being still, to be present in the moment instead of planning the next mission. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and painted everything gold, Hill found me again. He raised his glass, voice thick with emotion, and said, "We didn't stand for your rank today, Mom. We stood for the way you lead, for the way you made us feel like we mattered. Not just as sailors, but as people," Torres added, his prosthetic leg glinting in the fading light. "For the way you made us believe we could be better than we thought possible." I didn't know what to say. Words felt inadequate. So I just saluted them both, which wasn't protocol, but felt right. It was gratitude translated into the language we all spoke. As the last light faded, Ethan and I slipped away from the crowd. We stood on the bluff overlooking the water, the ocean stretching out endless and calm now after years of storms. The sound of waves was hypnotic, eternal. The same sound that had accompanied every significant moment of my life. "You did it," Ethan said quietly, his hand finding mine. "No," I answered, squeezing his fingers. "We did." The wind caught the edge of my jacket, lifting it just enough to reveal the sword at my side, the same one my team had presented to me when I was promoted. Not a weapon, but a symbol of endurance, of battles fought not with violence, but with persistence and integrity. I rested my hand on the hilt, feeling its weight. "He said I'd never wear these colors," I whispered into the gathering dusk. But maybe I was never meant to wear his. I was meant to wear mine, to choose my own legacy instead of inheriting his. Ethan didn't speak. He just nodded, understanding without needing explanation, and reached for my hand again. The night settled around us, gentle and golden and infinite. Somewhere behind us, the guests still laughed. The music still played. But for me, the ceremony was over, and something greater had begun. Not revenge, not vindication. Just peace, the kind that comes from finally accepting that some people will never see you. And that's okay because you see yourself in the distance across the quiet base, I could almost hear the echo of my father's voice. Discipline, precision, pride. Only now it didn't sting. It sounded like the language of a man who never learned how to say love, who'd built walls so high he couldn't see over them anymore. I closed my eyes, the salt wind against my face, and whispered into the dark, "I forgive you, sir. Not because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace." The morning after the wedding, the base was quiet, wrapped in that early stillness that comes before the world fully wakes. Seagulls drifted low over the water, their cries sharp against the gentle rhythm of waves. Ethan and I had left early, slipping away from lingering goodbyes and well wishes. We drove north until the ocean turned colder, until the military bases and uniforms gave way to pine trees and rocky coastlines. We found a small inn in Maine, the kind with wooden floors that creaked with history and smelled faintly of salt and fresh coffee. The owner, a retired Marine named Roy with a voice like gravel and eyes that had seen too much, recognized the bearing in our postures immediately. "You two look like service folks," he said, sliding over 2 steaming mugs without being asked. "This place runs on respect and blueberry pancakes. You'll fit right in." For 3 days, we didn't check our phones. No work emails, no news alerts, no interruptions. Just sea air, morning fog, and the sound of waves brushing the shore like breathing. It was the first time in years I'd felt the absence of urgency, the strange lightness that comes from not being needed somewhere else. On the 3rd morning, I woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Ethan flipping pages of a newspaper, an actual paper newspaper he'd found downstairs. He glanced at me, a quiet smile at the corner of his mouth. "Morning, Admiral. Morning, Agent." We had a rhythm already, an easy comfort that felt both new and inevitable. He slid a cup toward me, then hesitated before sliding my phone across the table. His expression shifted, became more serious. "You should see this," he said softly. The screen lit up 17 missed calls, all from one number. My stomach sank before my mind. Caught up, that physical response to seeing his contact information after years of silence. "Dad." The first call had come the night of the wedding. The last one just 2 hours ago. No voicemail, no text, just that number repeated over and over, as if trying to bridge years of distance through persistence alone, as if quantity could make up for quality. I set the phone down carefully like it might detonate. He called. Ethan nodded. 17 times. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The inn's old clock ticked faintly in the background, marking time that suddenly felt heavy with significance. Then, as if on cue, another buzz. A message. Not from him, but from my cousin Claire, the one relative who'd never picked sides in the silent war between my father and me. A single photo. No caption. It showed the chapel parking lot, grainy but clear enough. In the corner, half in shadow, stood a man in a dark army dress uniform, back straight, hands behind him, watching the chapel doors from a distance. My father. He'd been there. The next photo came seconds later. Same man, same parking lot. Only this time he was turning away, walking toward the street, shoulders hunched as if carrying something unbearably heavy. I felt something shift in my chest. Not anger, not sadness, just gravity like tectonic plates moving beneath the surface. "He was there," I whispered. "He came but couldn't walk in." Ethan leaned closer, studied the photo with the analytical eye of a federal agent trained to read situations. "Looks like he couldn't cross that threshold." "No," I said quietly, my voice steadier than I felt. "He never could. He built his own walls and now he's trapped behind them." We sat there for a long time, listening to the waves outside, to the world continuing without requiring anything from us. I thought about all the years between us, the letters I'd written and never sent, the calls that went unanswered, the silence he'd turned into a weapon that cut us both. And now this. A photograph of a man who came just close enough to witness what he'd lost, but couldn't bring himself to be part of it. Later that afternoon, while Ethan napped, I stepped outside onto the porch. The wind was cold and smelled like rain, like change. I opened my messages and typed something I didn't know I'd been holding back. "You should have come inside." It wasn't about proving you wrong. It was about showing you what right looks like. I stared at the words for a full minute, my thumb hovering over send. Then I deleted them. Forgiveness, I'd learned, doesn't always need an audience. It doesn't require the other person's participation. Sometimes it's something you do alone, for yourself, because carrying resentment is exhausting and you're tired of the weight. That evening, after dinner of fresh lobster and corn, the innkeeper handed me an envelope. "Mail came for you. he said, his voice neutral. Courier dropped it off an hour ago. Special delivery. No return address. I knew the handwriting immediately, square and deliberate and military precise. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The words typed, probably because his hands weren't steady enough to write clearly anymore. I couldn't step inside that chapel. I didn't know how to sit among people who already saw in you what I refused to acknowledge. I was wrong, Kira. About everything. About women in uniform. About what strength looks like. About you. If you'll let me, I'd like to talk. No uniforms, no protocol, no ranks. Just a father trying to understand a daughter he never took the time to know. R. Brennan. I read it 3 times, each pass revealing something new. The words didn't sting. They settled, like sediment after a storm, changing the landscape but not destroying it. When I showed Ethan, he said nothing at first, just read it carefully. Then gently, carefully, he asked, "Do you want to reply?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me wants to. Part of me thinks it's too late." "You don't owe him anything," he said. "Not as judgment, but as reminder. Whatever you decide is the right choice." "No," I replied, folding the letter carefully along its creases. "But maybe I owe myself the choice. Maybe I owe myself the chance to close this chapter on my terms, not his." That night, I took out a small note card from the inn's desk drawer and wrote back, keeping it simple. "Next time, the door will be open. No salutation, no rank, no emotion laid bare. Just clarity and offer extended without expectations." I sealed the envelope, placed it on the counter, and asked Roy to send it in the morning. He looked at me with the quiet understanding of a man who'd seen combat and grief and hard choices, who knew that some battles are won with words instead of weapons. "That's the best kind of message," he said, his voice rough but kind, short and earned. No begging, no explaining, just dignity. Later, as I stood outside under stars so bright they looked close enough to touch, I realized something profound. Revenge, the quiet kind, isn't about making someone hurt the way they hurt you. It's about showing them they no longer have the power to hurt you at all. It's about building a life so full and rich that their absence becomes irrelevant. My father would live with the image of me walking down that aisle in full uniform, surrounded by men who stood not because of blood ties or obligation, but because of belief and respect earned through action. And that would be enough. That was my victory. Not over him, but over the voice in my head that sounded like him. The voice that said I'd never be good enough. Ethan joined me outside, his arm wrapping around my shoulders, anchoring me. "You think he'll call again?" he asked. "Maybe," I said, watching the tide rise under moonlight. "But this time I'll answer. Not because I need to, but because I choose to." He smiled, pressed a kiss to my temple. "And say what?" "That I'm okay," I said simply, feeling the truth of it settle into my bones. "That I found peace and maybe he can too. That I don't need his approval anymore, but I'm willing to meet him halfway if he's finally ready to walk toward me instead of away." We stood there until the wind turned cold, watching the tide rise and fall with ancient rhythm. Somewhere beyond the horizon, my father existed. Alone, perhaps, but finally aware of what he'd walked away from. I didn't need an apology, not really. I didn't need him to grovel or beg or explain. I just needed him to know I'd survived without his blessing and thrived because I'd finally given myself the approval I'd been chasing from him. The next morning, as the sun came up over the harbour, painting everything gold and new, I checked my phone one last time. No new messages. But somehow that silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt finished, like a book closing after the final chapter. 6 months later, I found myself back in Washington, standing in a different uniform but carrying the same weight of expectation. The Department of Defense had invited me to deliver a keynote at a leadership forum titled Ethics in Command, Leading with Humanity in Military Operations. They wanted me to speak not because I was a Navy officer with an impressive record, but because my reforms had quietly saved lives, had changed how we thought about leadership in combat zones. I didn't feel like a symbol, though others insisted I'd become one. I felt like someone still learning what strength really meant, still figuring out how to lead with both steel and softness. The morning of the speech, I stood by the hotel mirror, adjusting the 4 gold stripes on my sleeve, the weight of command physically present on my shoulders. Outside the window, the city glowed grey with early light, monuments and power visible in every direction. Ethan watched from the doorway, tie half knotted, coffee in hand. "You ready, Admiral?" "Always," I said. though inside my pulse had that old familiar rhythm. Not nerves exactly, more like awareness, that heightened state before doing something that matters. The ballroom was filled with uniforms and suits, stars and bars and civilian blazers, generals and admirals and Pentagon officials. Rows of flags lined the stage like witnesses, each one representing sacrifice and service. I walked up to the podium, heels clicking against polished marble, and for a second I thought of my father, how he'd spent his life chasing perfection in posture and missed grace in practice. When I began to speak, I didn't use slides or prepared remarks. I just told stories about the young sailor who'd once written a suicide note that ended with, "Tell Admiral Brennan thank you. She saw me when everyone else looked through me." About the men who'd stood at my wedding when my father would not, who'd honored me not because I was perfect, but because I was present. About how discipline without compassion is just control, and how true authority isn't found in the loudest voice but in the calmest presence. I said, voice steady and clear, respect isn't inherited. It isn't handed down like medals or last names. It's earned every single day by showing up, standing tall, and doing what's right even when no one's watching, even when the cost is high. Leadership isn't about making people obey you. It's about making them believe in themselves. For a heartbeat, the room was silent. That profound silence that comes when truth has been spoken and everyone knows it. Then applause rose like surf, not roaring but steady, sincere, the sound of recognition. After the speech, I mingled with attendees, shaking hands, exchanging salutes, accepting compliments I still didn't quite know how to receive gracefully. When the crowd thinned, an aide approached with a cream-coloured envelope, its edges crisp and formal. "This arrived for you, Admiral. No sender listed, but it's marked personal and urgent." My chest tightened as I took it. I knew the handwriting before I opened it, recognized those deliberate squared-off letters even after all these years. Inside a single page. "I watched your speech on C-SPAN. I sat in my living room alone and listened to every word. I didn't enter the chapel that day because I didn't know how to sit among people who already saw in you what I refused to see for decades. I didn't salute. Not because you didn't earn it 1,000 times over, but because I didn't know how to honor what I never took the time to understand. I was wrong, Kira. About what makes a good officer. About what makes a good leader. About what makes a good person. You are all three, and I missed the chance to tell you that when it would have mattered most. If you'll let me, I'd like to talk." No uniforms. No ranks. No military protocol. Just a father trying to learn his daughter's language, trying to understand the woman she became despite him, not because of him. Robert Brennan, I read it 3 times, my throat tightening not from anger this time, but from something gentler. Grief maybe for all the years we'd lost. Or grace for the possibility of reclaiming what was left. That evening, Ethan found me sitting at the kitchen table of our apartment, letter open beside my coffee, staring at nothing and everything. "He finally said something," Ethan murmured, reading my expression before I spoke. I nodded. "He did. Are you going to meet him?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me wants to. Part of me thinks it's too late, that too much damage has been done." "You don't owe him anything," he said softly, sitting beside me. "You know that, right? Whatever you decide, it's your choice to make." "No," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "But maybe I owe myself the peace of hearing it in person. Maybe I owe myself closure, whatever that looks like." A week later, I met him at Arlington National Cemetery, the one place where silence feels sacred instead of cruel, where every grave tells a story of service and sacrifice. The grass was cut with military precision. The air was crisp and still, heavy with the weight of all those white stones stretching toward the horizon. He was waiting by my mother's headstone, wearing civilian clothes for the first time in my memory. No rank insignia, no medals, no armor. Just a man who'd finally put down the weight he'd carried for too long, who looked smaller somehow without the uniform to hide behind. He turned when he heard my footsteps, and I saw something in his face I'd never seen before, vulnerability. His eyes were red-rimmed, his jaw trembling slightly as he fought for composure. "You look like your mother when you stand like that," he said, his voice rough. Proud but not arrogant, strong but not hard. It was the first thing he'd said to me in years that didn't sound like an order or a criticism. We talked for hours, not sitting but walking among the graves, surrounded by the evidence of service and sacrifice. We didn't talk about war or medals or who was right. We talked about regret, about what silence costs, about the difference between pride and principle, about how fear can make us cruel to the people we love most. At one point, he stopped walking, looked down at the ground, his hands trembling. "I thought I was teaching you strength," he said, voice breaking. "I thought discipline and toughness would prepare you for a hard world. I didn't realize you already had strength, a different kind. The kind your mother had, the kind that bends without breaking." I didn't know what to say, so I said the truth. The words I'd been carrying for years. "You taught me duty, Dad. You taught me discipline and precision and how to stand tall under pressure. But I had to learn love somewhere else. I had to learn that being strong doesn't mean being alone." He nodded, tears finally breaking free, running down weathered cheeks. "I'm sorry, Kira. For all of it. For every time I should have been there and wasn't. For every word I should have said and didn't." "I know," I said quietly. And I did. I could see it in every line of his face, in the way he held himself like a man carrying unbearable weight. Before we parted, he straightened his back, old habits dying hard, and raised his hand in a slow, imperfect salute. It wasn't crisp. It wasn't by the book. His hand shook and his form was off. But it was the truest gesture I'd ever seen him make, the most honest acknowledgement he'd ever offered. I returned the salute, not because he'd earned forgiveness yet, but because I was choosing to offer it. Not for him, but for me. Because carrying resentment was exhausting, and I was finally ready to put it down. That night, Ethan and I sat together on our apartment balcony, city lights shimmering like stars on pavement, the distant sound of traffic creating white noise that felt almost peaceful. I told him about the salute, about the tears, about the apology that had taken 30 years to arrive. He didn't ask what it meant or what came next. He just held my hand until words weren't needed, until the silence between us felt like comfort instead of distance. Months passed. Life settled into its steady rhythm of duty and quiet mornings, of work that mattered and love that sustained. My father wrote again, short letters typed and direct. No grand apologies or flowery language, just updates about his life. Memories he'd never shared before, small olive branches extended carefully. I answered every few weeks, equally brief, equally careful. Slowly, awkwardly, like learning a new language, the silence broke. A year to the day after the wedding, I stood on another stage. This time receiving the Department of Defense Excellence in Ethical Command Award, recognition for changing how the military thought about leadership and mental health. Ethan sat in the front row, pride evident in every line of his face. And in the back, among the crowd of officers and cadets and Pentagon brass, stood my father. When the ceremony ended, I looked toward him. For a heartbeat, he hesitated, as if uncertain whether he had the right to approach. Then, in a motion so slow it nearly undid me, he raised his hand once more. This time a full salute, sharp and deliberate, the kind he'd spent 40 years perfecting. I returned it, my hand moving on muscle memory, completing the gesture that finally closed the distance between us. As the applause filled the hall, I thought of something my mother used to say, words I'd carried like a talisman through every storm. Storms aren't meant to destroy you, Kira. They're meant to define you. The strongest steel is forged in the hottest fire. Later that evening, walking outside under the soft glow of streetlights, cherry blossoms drifting in the spring air, I checked my phone. A message from one of my old SEALs had arrived. "Still thinking about your wedding day, ma'am. Never seen that many warriors cry during a ceremony." That was the day we realized something important blood doesn't salute, but honor does. "And you earned every salute in that room." I smiled, feeling something unlock in my chest, and typed back. "Some salutes never fade. They just find their way home. Thank you for standing with me." As I hit send, I realized the story was never about revenge at all. It was about reconciliation, the kind that doesn't demand surrender, only understanding. It was about finding peace not in someone else's approval, but in your own acceptance of who you've become. My father hadn't changed overnight. He was still learning, still struggling with decades of conditioning that told him emotions were weakness. But something fundamental had shifted. We were no longer opponents on the same battlefield, locked in a war neither could win. We were simply two people trying to find common ground, trying to build something new from the wreckage of what had been. Standing beneath the flag that night, wind rustling through the trees, cherry blossoms falling like snow, I whispered a final quiet prayer. Not to God or country or any higher power, but to myself, to the woman I'd become through storms and silence and the strength they'd given me. "Thank you," I whispered to the night. To my younger self who'd refused to quit. To the woman who'd learned to wear her own colors instead of someone else's expectations. Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for believing you were enough. Because sometimes the most powerful victory isn't in breaking someone's pride or proving them wrong. It's in healing what pride broke. It's in choosing forgiveness, not because the other person deserves it, but because you deserve peace. If this story touched you, take a moment to reflect. Who have you forgiven quietly, releasing them not for their sake, but for your own? Who stood for you when others walked away, offering loyalty when blood failed? Share your story, or just stand tall and keep building your own legacy, one that doesn't require anyone's approval but your own. Your colors are yours to choose. Wear them proud.